Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Can I provide a definition?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
I can't.
You can't?
Not in this context.
So
I'm not a biologist.
So the case comes at a time when 26 states have passed laws restricting healthcare treatments for transgender youth, according to a CNN analysis of data from the nonprofit think tank Movement Advancement Project. So how do you plan to argue before the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that could have wide-ranging implications beyond the state of Tennessee?
Well, thank you for having me, Jake. And obviously, this is a critical inflection point for transgender people across the country. We're coming off of an election season where transgender people played an outside role in people's consciousness in terms of the way in which we were situated as a threat to others. And when we look at the map of states that ban this type of evidence-based healthcare, we went from 0 states that had these bans in 2020 to now more than half the country. So before the court tomorrow, the question is really a simple one as I see it. It's really, this is a law that bans medical treatment only when it is prescribed inconsistent with an individual's sex. Our argument is that that treats people differently because of their sex, and therefore the court has to treat it like all other forms of sex discrimination, and that's why it's unconstitutional.
So attorneys representing the state of Tennessee told the U.S. Supreme Court, quote, if the government's theory holds, men who identify as women could claim constitutionally based access to women's bathrooms, women's locker rooms, and women's sports. Accepting that theory would perversely erode women's rights and jeopardize landmark statutes protecting women's equal access to schools, winners' podiums, and beyond. What's your response to that?
Well, I obviously disagree with that premise that allowing transgender women into women's sports or women's bathroom is a threat to women, but it is also not the question before the court in this case. And in fact, it is a totally independent question about whether a law that bans medical care for transgender adolescents discriminates against people based on sex versus these separate cases that preceded any of these healthcare bans will continue to be litigated in the courts regardless of the outcome here. So that clearly is conflating a bunch of different questions. The question before the court tomorrow is about whether banning medical care, overriding the consent of parents, the recommendations of doctors is a violation of equal protection.
Democrats have been attacking Republicans on the topic of trans issues for years now, and they go far as even to say it's really kind of weird that you're so fixated on protecting your children from permanent bodily harm and mutilation. And of course, that brings us to Chase Strangio, who's arguing before the Supreme Court right now that girls should have access to the same testosterone treatments that men get. And this is why it's so important to have a grasp of objective reality and a bit of common sense in all of our leaders, because right now we have some Supreme Court justices who lack a little bit of all of that, because this argument being made right now before the Supreme Court is that since men can have testosterone treatment, say you suffer from low T or you're a boy who wants to kickstart his puberty, then women and girls should have that exact same access. But of course, there's a little problem here because men on average have 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone, whereas women have 15 to 70. That's about 20 times the difference between the sexes. And this argument they're making on the surface level makes a little bit of sense because they're saying, hey, if men have access to it, why in the world can't women have access to it? And that, of course, is where the understanding of reality and common sense really come into play, because what is the purpose behind those treatments and what benefits do they have? So what we're going to see today, of course, is the idiocy of these leftist Supreme Court justices being revealed and the common sense of the right-wing Supreme Court justices on display as well. But before we get to these clips, please like and comment on this video so we can break through the algorithms. Here we go.
That was sort of like the starting point. The question was whether it was discriminatory because it applied to both races and it wasn't, necessarily invidious or whatever. But, as I read the statute here, the case here, the court starts off by saying that Virginia is now one of 16 states which prohibit and punish marriages on the basis of racial classifications. And when you look at the structure of that law, it looks in terms of, you can't do something that is inconsistent with your own characteristics. It's sort of the same thing. So it's interesting to me that we now have this different argument, and I wonder whether Virginia could have gotten away with what they did here by just making a classification argument the way that Tennessee is in this case.
Cannot eliminate the risk of detransitioners. So it becomes a pure exercise of weighing benefits versus risk. And the question of how many minors have to have their bodies irreparably harmed for unproven benefits is one that is best left.
I'm sorry, Counselor. Every medical treatment has a risk. Even taking aspirin. there is always going to be a percentage of the population under any medical treatment that's going to suffer a harm. So the question in my mind is not, do policymakers decide whether one person's life is more valuable than the millions of others who get relief from this treatment? The question is, can you stop one sex from the other?
So what Justice Ketanji Brown was actually trying to draw a parallel to was all of the anti-interracial marriage laws we used to have in this country and comparing it to this current law, because clearly not allowing two people to get married is the exact same thing as giving a child permanent altering hormone therapy that will affect them for the rest of their life and is irreversible. But all of that, who cares? Because Sonia Sotomayor is out here saying it's the same as taking an aspirin. People get hurt from taking simple medications all the time. Yeah, but can they bounce back from that, right? Once you start doing all of these hormone treatments, once you start doing all of these surgeries, there is no going back. It is going to be permanent. And that, of course, was one of the big lies from the left when all of this first started. A lot of people were saying, oh, we can start kids on these hormone blockers, just kind of put a pin in their development until a later date where we can undo it. Well, it turns out that's not true. These are permanent changes that will affect them for the rest of their life. But apparently Justice Sotomayor doesn't realize that. And as I often say on this channel, you have to be pretty highly educated to be this uninformed on a topic. But let's go ahead and jump to the other side and watch some right-wing justices take this stuff apart.
A question about the state of medical evidence at the present time. In your petition, you made a sweeping statement, which I will quote. Overwhelming evidence establishes that the appropriate gender-affirming treatment with puberty blockers and hormones directly and substantially improves the physical, psychological well-being of transgender adolescents with gender dysphoria. That was in November 2023. Now, even before then, the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare wrote the following. They currently assess, quote, that the risks of puberty blockers and gender-affirming treatment are likely to outweigh the expected benefits of these treatments, which is directly contrary to the sweeping statement in your petition. After the filing of your petition, of course, we saw the release of the Cass report in the United Kingdom, which found a complete lack of high-quality evidence showing that the benefits of the treatments in question here outweigh the risks. And so I wonder if you would like to stand by the statement that you made in your petition, or if you think it would now be appropriate to modify that and withdraw the statement that there is overwhelming evidence establishing that these treatments have benefits that greatly outweigh the risks and the dangers.
I, of course, acknowledge, Justice Alito, that there is a lot of debate happening here and abroad about the proper model of delivery of this care and exactly when adolescents should receive it and how to identify the adolescents for whom it would be helpful.
Medical questions that seem to me to be hotly disputed, and that's a bit distressing. One of them has to do with the risk of suicide. Do you maintain that the procedures and medications in question reduce the risk of suicide?
I do, Justice Alito, maintain that the medications in question reduce the risk of depression, anxiety, and suicidality, which are all indicators of potential suicide.
And do you think that's clearly established? Do you think there's reason for disagreement about that?
I do think it is clearly established in the science and in the record. I think, as with all underlying questions of looking at evidence, there can be disagreement. I don't dispute that. But here, and sort of going back to questions about the Cass review, for example, the Cass review only looked at studies up until 2022.
Well, I don't regard the Cass review as necessarily as the Bible or as something that's true in every respect. But on page 195 of the Cass report, it says, there is no evidence that gender affirmative treatments reduce suicide.
What I think that is referring to is there is no evidence in the studies that this treatment
reduces completed suicide. And the reason for that is completed suicide, thankfully and admittedly, is rare, and we're talking about a very small population of individuals with studies that don't necessarily have completed suicides within them. However, there are multiple studies, long-term longitudinal studies, that do show that there is a reduction in suicidality, which I think is a positive outcome to this treatment.
So once again, we're witnessing the party of science completely ignoring the science. But what else do we expect from a group of people who can't even identify what a woman is? And that's why Justice Alito is so perfect in pointing this out. Hey, all of these studies coming out from Europe are not backing up your claims. They don't improve physiological health of the children. They don't improve the suicidality and mental health of the children, right? None of that is true. And by the way, Europe has completely stopped all of the transitioning of children because of this study and others like it, where they've said, hey, there is no net benefit. None of the left's claims are turning out to be true. And all we're really doing is harming children for no perceivable benefit, right? So that is why Europe has moved along from this, and they're way ahead of the curve on Americans, all right? So I'm glad that we have some people with actual common sense on the Supreme Court who will hopefully keep this craziness away from the youth. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and stay safe out there, people, because they're coming after you.